Hi everyone, this is Karen Whitaker with the League of American Bicyclists. Thanks for joining me for our webinar for the National Bike Summit. Today we'll go over the policy asks for our lobbying day on March 12th. I want to remind everyone that there is a question box. If you have any questions, please go ahead and type them in. I'll stop at the end of each bill to look at those questions and go through the answers. So with that, I'll get started. Thanks for joining. What I'd like to cover tonight is do a quick recap of the How to Lobby webinar that was last Wednesday. We'll talk a little bit, and then we'll get into the ask for 2019, the Bicycle Commuter Benefit Act, the Commute Act, which is a planning act. We have an ask to prioritize vulnerable user safety, and an ask to improve transportation alternatives. Okay. So how to prepare? This was part of the How to Lobby webinar. Just to remind you, you should take 15 minutes or so for each meeting. Look at your member of Congress, look at your senators, find out what of their interests might meet with bicycling. So if they're interested in health, you can talk about the health benefits of bicycling. If they're interested in equity, you can talk about offering more transportation options to everyone to get around. If you're not sure where there's an interest, always think about the economy. Everybody cares about the economy. It's also great if you know some local examples of really popular projects, safety projects, new trails, anything like that. If you have newspaper articles or statements by your mayor, your council members, Chamber of Commerce, any business support, it's good to know that and have that with you. And then for tomorrow, we'll put out a blog that will have draft fact sheets on all of our asks. So another way you can prepare is to go through those and see if you have any questions. We will also talk about this at the summit, the Sunday breakfast. I'll go through a similar presentation to this and be there to ask questions or to answer questions regarding our lobby asks. Then again on Monday afternoon, we'll have another How to Lobby session. It will be different from the webinar. I'm going to bring in some of my colleagues who lobby, and you can ask us all the tough questions. After that, we'll have a state delegation meeting, and that's a chance for you to get together with everyone else from your state to prepare for your lobby meetings on Tuesday. Just a quick reminder, this weekend is daylight savings time. So if you're going to come to the Ask seminar at the summit for breakfast on Sunday, just be aware it's going to feel earlier, but don't worry, we'll have breakfast. We'll have coffee and tea and soda and water all day. We'll keep you hydrated and caffeinated for the summit. So at the state delegation meeting, that is your opportunity to share your research and your knowledge on the members, to go over your schedule, to see the final fact sheets in the packets, and to plan for your Hill meetings. And to remember, we really want to stay focused on the asks in those meetings. Within your team, both at the summit and maybe even right before your meetings, again, agree on that angle on how you're going to connect bicycling to your district to that member's interest, because they're going to want to know specific local interest. Everyone should have a very short 1 to 2 sentence, 30-second introduction of who you are and why you're here lobbying for biking. And you should also, I always suggest that you meet 10 minutes ahead of time in the hallway outside of your meeting, just to remember, okay, this is what we're going to say, right? And to go through the roles. Who's going to lead the meeting? Who's going to make each of the asks? Who's going to take notes? Make sure you get the handouts. And then who's going to send the follow-up email? That's your opportunity. I also want to remind folks that the follow-up is well, it's definitely as important in the meeting as the meeting. Sometimes it can be even more important. So in our short-term goal is to get an answer. Will they co-sponsor the Commute Act? We want to get them on record. And please report to me what they say, because that will help me build a relationship here. But we also want the longer-term goal of you to build a relationship with your members of Congress and their offices, their staff, to continue that relationship. You can clarify any questions you have about what they care about, what they're thinking about these bills. It's also a chance to answer any questions that they had, and to again make the ask. There's some research that when local community members go back to their legislator 8 to 10 times a year with the same ask, it really makes a difference in how that legislator thinks of the ask. Especially when it's an issue that they may not already have a position on. And that's what we find about bicycling, especially for new members. They don't really have a position on it, and you're asking them and you're making the case over and over again is really what can sway them. Okay. Because that goal really is to keep it going and to become a resource. Several advocates who come to the summit will often be on the call list of the staffer, the transportation staffer, when they're deciding about other bills or new bills. So if you can get on their list as a resource, then you are the one they will turn to when they want to know something about biking, especially as it affects their district. So please think about becoming a resource, contacting that staff. Once a month is probably enough. You don't want to oversaturate them, but let them know about anything that's happening in your district. If you work for the local organization or volunteer with them, what's happening? Are you having any events? Was there a recent policy win? Is there a new bike lane going in somewhere that you want to let them know about? And invite them to those events. If you see an alert from the league, an action alert, think about, instead of just clicking is always great, but maybe you could even go a step further and send a personal email to the staffer and say, this is why I care about this issue. This is why it matters for our district. And of course, we hope you keep coming back to the summit. And one way that we are going to both encourage you to come back and encourage you to do some of that follow-up is that this year, between April 15th and the 26th, we're going to do a district visit campaign. And if you go ahead and you do that visit, you send us a meeting report, and we hope you'll also tweet about it, maybe send a picture. But if you do a district meeting with your representative during those 2 weeks in April, we'll give you a discount to the 2020 National Bike Summit. We're really trying to encourage folks to get out there and make that ask. And it's really important this Congress because there's a lot going on. Okay. Getting into the asks. Great. Okay, getting into the asks. When we look at federal policy, there's two things we expect to happen in this Congress. One is that we know that what happens with all big bills, and tax reform not being any different, Congress passes it, and then they want to make some changes shortly after. Sometimes it's it's just an edit that needs to be done, but it's an opportunity to look at making some changes. And we want to be prepared for that to get a bike commuter benefit back into the tax law. And then, of course, we think that the transportation reauthorization is due. The current transportation bill will expire in September 2020, and we want to get our priorities into the next bill. Now, we've been hearing about an infrastructure package forever, and there's always a possibility that that will happen, but we're choosing to focus on the reauthorization because there's a deadline for that, and anything we work on for the reauthorization, we can quickly switch and try to push it into an infrastructure package if that's what's going to happen. Right now, the emphasis on that infrastructure package is really to get the funding to write a good transportation reauthorization. Okay. So moving on to the commuter benefit. There has been a bike commuter benefit. It was put in place in 2009 in the stimulus package by our friend and champion, Mr. Earl Blumenauer from Oregon. There's two parts for the employee and the employer. The old benefit for the employee gave you up to $20 a month post-tax benefits. So your employer could pay you up to $20 a month post-tax benefit for bike purchases, for maintenance and equipment, helmets, lights, pedals, things like that. But in order to get it, the employee had to collect the receipts from the money that you spent, and then the employer had to reimburse those receipts and verify them. And that was a little bit cumbersome, especially for employers. The other big issue with it was that if you chose to use your bike benefit, you could not use a transit benefit or a parking benefit. And while the bike benefit was set at $20 a month, the transit benefit, I believe it's up to $260 now. So people who were using both would generally just get the transit benefit. What happened in the tax reform bill of 2017 is they removed the bike commuter benefit along with some other ones for the goal to, quote, simplify the tax code, unquote. So they said, oh, this one's pretty small. We're just going to get rid of it. What they didn't do is they left in the employer benefit. So if the employer still offers a bike commuter benefit, they can still write that off, as long as that employee does not take the transit benefit. So what the Bike Commuter Benefit Act, I think it's the Bike Commuter Act of 2019 does, is it reinstates and it improves on the former bike benefit. And it does that in a number of ways. One, it includes bike share membership and e-bikes. Two, it simplifies the benefit by changing it from a reimbursement to a benefit. So that means that you don't have to collect the receipts anymore, and it makes the benefit pre-tax. So you can get it taken out of your pay before that pay is taxed. And the way it does this is it makes the bike benefit part of the parking benefit. So you can use up to 20% of your parking benefit, which would be up to $52 a month right now. You could use that for your bike benefit. And then if you use the rest of the parking benefit for parking, you could do that. But you could also use that in conjunction with transit. And I think that is really exciting because most people who bike to work also use a different modes at least once in a while. So this way you can do both. The other thing is by making it part of the parking benefit and the transit benefit are permanent and they increase each year. So by making part of that, we'll see automatic increases. So how is this going to work for the average commuter? Honestly, you know, that will be determined if and when the bill passes by the IRS. But there's some possibilities that I think we'll see. First of all, I think the bike share benefit can act like a transit benefit where you put it right onto your card and then you have the benefit. And so organizations or companies like Lyft are supporting this benefit. They also own Motivate, which is all of the docked, or not all, but many of the docked bike systems. And so they're trying to figure out how that would work. The other thing we saw with the bike benefit before is some of the benefits company, ours is Connect Your Care here at the League, but companies like that, like Edenrod, what they would offer is a voucher to participating bike stores. So you would get a voucher to spend, used to be up to $20, that could only be spent at the bike store on things like maintenance and equipment and things like that are allowed by the benefit. Another option longer term that we're talking about and hoping to get is If you have a health savings account card that allows you to pay for your prescriptions on it, maybe some over-the-counter medicine, things like that, imagine if we could get a commuter card, and then you could use that to pay for things at the bike shop, or possibly for transit, would have to see, but that's sort of where we're hoping this goes. Okay, so how do we sell it to Congress? And while I'm talking through this, feel free to add some questions. I'm going to stop for questions in a few slides. So one thing that we fought for and won is that states are required to have a performance goal, performance measure on shifting transportation trips away from single occupancy motor vehicles. And by offering incentives for employees and employers to promote biking to work, that can help the state meet those goals. So Congress said they had to have a performance goal on congestion mitigation and air quality. We advocated for that to be a goal of shifting trips from single occupancy motor vehicles to other modes. We won on that. So now we're saying, hey, this bike benefit will help states meet that goal. Another thing we saw during the recession is that when we saw a 4% decrease in traffic volumes between 2007 and 2008, we saw an almost 30% decrease in traffic congestion. So we know that by just changing a small percentage of trips, we'll get a much larger effect on congestion. And that's another reason to promote biking to work, and a bike benefit does that. And finally, we know that investing in and encouraging bicycling can improve air quality. We know that people outside the car actually are exposed to less air pollutants than those in the cars. So that's one thing, but also as we get more people biking, we'll see that that we can reduce greenhouse gases. Transportation has overtaken power generation as the largest producer of greenhouse gas emissions. That's something biking can help with. And I would use that argument in offices that have that are interested in addressing climate. So the ask for the bike commuter benefit is, will you co-sponsor the Bike Commuter Benefit Act of 2019? These are our original co-sponsors, Representative Earl Blumenauer from Oregon in the black fleece, and Representative Vern Buchanan from Florida in the red fleece. Those are also the co-chairs of the Congressional Bike Caucus. All right. Any questions on the bike commuter benefit? No? All right. Okay, then. We'll move on. Feel free, if you want to ask a question a little later, to go ahead and stick that in, or write that in. Okay, so moving on to the reauthorization platform. Overall, as we look to the next transportation bill, we have a number of funding and policy goals. On the funding side, we want to improve and increase the Transportation Alternatives Program. We want to break into funding for the Highway Safety Improvement Program. We're talking about advocating for a set-aside for biking and walking projects on federal lands. On the policy side, we want to improve the planning process by giving planners more data. We're looking at storm resiliency and how bicycling can be used post-storm to bring in food and emergency, medical equipment, and even just power sources after a storm, especially in areas where maybe advocates aren't in yet. And then finally, we're working on Congress to get a new bill on automated vehicles. If you remember, the League fought against the AV START bill last year, and we're hoping to find a better solution this year. Okay, I got some questions. Is there a bill number yet? There is not. The commuter bill will be introduced tomorrow morning. The planning bill, which I'm about to talk about in a minute, that's going to get introduced on Wednesday, so we won't have the bill numbers until you get here. So we will put some fact sheets out before that as drafts for you to see, but they won't be the final copies until we get the bill number. Excuse me. All right. And then, one second, we got a question. What law is the source of the state requirement to decrease motor vehicle trips? So that in MAP 21, which was the transportation bill that passed in 2012, it required the DOT to come up with performance measures on a number of different topics, congestion mitigation and air quality being two of the topics. Excuse me again. So that happened in 2012. It took a long time to get those in. In 2016, 2017 is when DOT was developing its congestion mitigation performance measures. We advocated for this one to say you need to shift the percentage of trips from single occupancy vehicles to other modes. That one went in. At the time, there was also one to reduce greenhouse gases. Those performance measures were made final in the last days of the Obama administration, or final drafts. When the Trump administration came in under Secretary Chow, they have since gotten rid of the reduced greenhouse gas one, but they did keep this mode shift one, which we are excited about and look forward to working on moving forward. All right, thanks for the questions. So these are all the things we're hoping to do in the bill. Not all of these asks are quite ripe yet. We don't have a bill on all of them. So for this summit, we are going to focus on the COMMUTE Act and planning, which is a bill. And then we're going to have two other asks in the Senate on transportation alternatives in the Highway Safety Improvement Program. And the reason we're doing an ask, even though we don't have a bill quite yet, is because the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, that's the committee that writes the highway and roads part of the bill, which includes the biking and walking programs. Their committee is run by Chairman Barrasso from Wyoming. Ranking Democrat is Mr. Carper from Delaware. But they are moving really fast. They want to get out in front of the House. They want to set the tone for reauthorization. Committee members on the Senate EPW, they have to get their priorities in writing to the committee by this Thursday, I think, or Friday, the 7th. Is it? No, that's Thursday. Yeah, by the 7th. And then just today, they put out word to the rest of the Senate, we want to know what your priorities are, and you have a month to do it. So the summit is really well timed in that we're going to be there within that month when senators have to figure out what their transportation priorities are. It's really interesting that they're moving this fast because they rarely move this fast. And a lot of the other stakeholder groups haven't really figured out what their priorities are. You know, everyone is sort of waiting to see who the new Congress was, what committees they were on. A lot of groups like ours weren't planning on having that until this summer. Because we have the summit, we were working hard a little bit earlier than most, and so we have our asks ready. So when I'm going into these committee offices, they're scrambling. And so the members who aren't on the committee, the senators not on the committee, are really going to be scrambling. So this is our opportunities to get our priorities into the first draft and to be ahead of folks. So let's start off by talking about the COMMUTE Act. For those of you who were at the summit last year, this is very similar to the House bill that we had then. The COMMUTE Act, the goal of it is to improve transportation planning by giving states and MPOs access data. And what I mean by access data is that the data they get now from the US DOT and others, it's a lot of congestion data and level of service data. So it's kind of like how you do a bike count. You go out to an intersection and you count how many cars get past this point in the hours between 5 and 6. And then you sort of figure out how fast are they moving, What, do we need to add another lane to get these cars through faster? That's how it's generally used. But access data is a little different. It's not looking at any one spot in the transportation system. It's looking at how well the system can do to get people from where they live to where they want to go, from their place of origin to their destination. And it goes across all modes, whether it's cars, transit, biking, and walking. It's how well does the transportation system connect you to your destinations. It's like a modeling program. What it does, this is an example. This data now exists in the private sector, and we see a couple states using it. Utah uses it, Delaware uses it, but we want to get it out more broadly. And I'll use this example on the north side of this. We have a low-income community. On the south side, you have a little bit of a downtown area that has jobs and services and grocery stores. But if you don't have a car, you can't get across that major road, or certainly you can't get across it safely. And so this was in Madison. They were looking at, what if we built a bike ped bridge over this? What would that do? And what they found was that it would connect the 5,600 households to the north to these jobs and services within a 15-minute bike ride, or maybe a 30-minute walk. And so it's looking at things like that. It's modeling, if we built this project, how many people or how many households would have access to these services. And they look at, what modes that road is open to. So if something looks extremely dangerous for biking, they don't include it. They use an average speed of 8.5 miles per hour, a very easy speed for most people on a bike. And it just shows, okay, biking can connect these people on something that might be, because of the road system, could be a 40-minute transit ride. And so we think that that data could be really valuable. What the bill does, it's a pilot project. It gives that kind of access data to 5 states, to 15 areas, whether they be city or rural areas. So that data would go to 5 large MPOs, 5 small MPOs, MPO being a metropolitan planning organization, and then 5 rural areas. And if you were here last year, the things in red are what's new in this bill. So the 5 rural areas are new. Also, the thing that's new is that the 5 states that receive the data in this pilot project, they have to share it with the local governments in their state, which is good. But they also have to share it with researchers, which I think is great, because if we can get it in the hand of researchers, and researchers can do that modeling, we can probably get it in the hand of advocates. And so when advocates are going to planning meetings, they can say, well, what about this project? What about this project? And I think that can really help us. It's a pilot project because it's new, and what will happen is that the states and the municipalities and the rural areas that get the data, they'll use it, and then they'll report back to DOT and Congress on how they used it. And then if it seems worthwhile, Congress and DOT can think about expanding it to all the states and municipalities. What we're trying to get to, we had talked before about a performance measure on connectivity. This is sort of the first step in that. So, and as an FYI, the funding for this would come out of the DOT administrative budget. That will be on the fact sheet. That may be something you get asked about. Why it matters? We need a better way to measure how well our system connects people to where they want to go, using all modes and for all people. We want to understand how infrastructure connects people to destinations, because that can make our networks more efficient. It can make us use our limited transportation dollars more efficiently, rather than just saying, hey, this road is congested, let's add a lane. Maybe if we knew where those people were coming from and where they were going, there's a more efficient way to fix that problem. And then finally, this data provides information about all the trips people take, not just their commute to work. And that can really improve the planning process and the systems that we need. So the ask on this is, will you co-sponsor the COMMUTE Act? This bill is in both the House and the Senate. You can see we have 3 original sponsors in the House and 2 in the Senate. You can see 2 of the House members are from Utah. That's a state that's using it. They think it's great. They want to get it out there more. DeSaulnier's staff is a land use planner. He loves this bill. And then we have both Senator Jody Ernst and Senator Tammy Baldwin on the Senate side, both interested in good planning, both on the relevant committee. So I really think that this bill has a chance of passing or being included in the transportation bill when that happens. Okay. So moving on to the, any questions on that? Please feel free to add some in. In the meantime, I'm going to move on to talk about the transportation funding programs and our asks on those. So when we look at where federal funding for active transportation, biking and walking comes from, looking at the 2 years of 2016 and 2017, you can see that TA stands for Transportation Alternatives. If you look at transportation alternatives, and then you look at the old transportation enhancements and safe routes to school money, the 4th right here, you add those 2 together, that's about 50%. So when we think about strengthening funding for biking and walking, we want to strengthen the Transportation Alternatives Program and make it work as best it can. But then if you look, we saw the way at the end, not the other, but the next one over, the HSIP, that stands for Highway Safety Improvement Program. We're getting less than 1% of the state's Highway Safety and Improvement Program is going to biking and walking. And that we feel needs to change. And so that's why we're focusing on safety and transportation alternatives. If you look at safety, right now, pedestrians and bicyclists make up 12% of the trips. We make up 18% of the fatalities, but we're getting less than 1% of the safety funding. And that's what we want to change. Now, the reason that's happening, it's not just because states are ignoring it, it's because states have a system of how they give out their safety money, their HSIP money, which they've done for a long time. Part of that is that the states really focus on the roads that connect one community to another, and less the roads within the community. The other problem is that for a long time, this program ran on focusing on hotspots. So states developed these safety formulas to find where are the specific spots where we're seeing the most roadway fatalities. And those often came up as intersections or places on highways. But what we know, particularly about pedestrian fatalities and somewhat about bicyclist fatalities, is that they don't always happen in one spot. And because of that, they just don't get picked up on these formulas. When you look at pedestrian fatalities, they happen along corridors. Places like this in these pictures, these huge arterials that they have high speeds, but they don't have a lot of crosswalks, they don't have a lot of sidewalks. It's a major problem. We also know when the league did its Every Bicyclist Count report back in, I think it was 2013, where we looked at every fatality for a year, we found that the most dangerous place for bicyclists was being passed from behind. And again, these roads are part of the problem. If there's no shoulder, you've got cars going at a high speed, they don't move over. That's where we're seeing those fatalities. And so that's what we want to address. Our idea for a legislative fix on that is what's called a special rule. So in safety, in the Highway Safety Improvement Program, there's already special rules for older drivers and pedestrians. There's another for dangerous, high-risk rural roads. We want to make one for vulnerable users, where we say that if your state or a tribal land has areas, again, whether it be a metropolitan area or a rural area, that is a high rate of vulnerable user fatalities, say 1.5 per 100,000, then the state has to spend some of its safety money on vulnerable user safety in those areas. Part of our idea is that for the large MPOs, it would be sub-allocated to them, and then they could they could disperse the money, use the money. And in smaller areas that the state would have to work in consultation with the local government. The idea being that, when we look at Vision Zero cities, we often see statistics that 70 or 75% of the fatalities are happening on 10% of the roads. The local governments are going to know what those roads are, and so they're going to know where to make the fixes. They're also going to know, hey, if we do this one treatment, something that's happening in DC where I live, they said left-hand turns are a real danger for pedestrians because the driver's looking for oncoming traffic. So they're putting in barriers in the middle of the road, so the car really has to make a very deliberate left-hand turn and slow down. So a local government is going to know what works in their community, and that's why we want to add in that bit of local control. Okay. So the Senate asked, oops, I'm going the wrong way. Sorry about that. So the Senate ask is to ask your office. We know that the EPW committee is asking Senate offices for their transportation priorities this month. Will you list bicyclist and pedestrian safety as one of your transportation priorities for the Environment and Public Works Committee? Just a FYI, in that picture, with the shirts, those are all state DOT officials who are on the Council for Active Transportation. All right, I got a question. Is there a way to get a list of the 5 worst large and small MPOs? I assume by worst, you mean most dangerous, most fatalities. For pedestrians, Transportation for America puts out the Dangerous by Design sheet, which looks at metropolitan areas. Their areas are bigger than MPOs, so that's one place. That's another thing we're looking at. It's hard to get that data on the rate, but if we put it in law, we would get it. What I would say is most of the large MPOs would fall under that 1.5 fatalities per 100,000 population. So I don't have a specific list, but I can tell you that. That will be something we can work on after the summit. So if you shoot me an email after the summit, that's on my list of projects. Okay. Any other questions? Please type them in. Moving on to transportation alternatives. Remember, transportation alternatives and its older programs, they're about 50% of the funding for biking and walking. And what we know about this program is that only about half of the applications are being selected. So one of the things we won in the last transportation bill back in 2015, the FAST Act, was that now states have to report how many how many applications they got and how much the cost of all those applications would be and how many applications they selected and the overall cost of those they selected. So we know that they're selecting about 47% to get funded, but of the total funding ask, only 31% of that is being met. And that means that across the country, over $3 billion of transportation alternative project applications have been left unfunded. That's 4 years worth of transportation alternatives funding. So we know there's a huge demand, there's a huge unmet demand for bicycling and walking. Okay. So one of the things you'll have in your packets are a synthesis of those transportation alternatives spending reports. This is Ohio. So in Ohio, we can see that 57% of their applications did not get funded, that there's over 41 million, almost $42 million of project applications from Ohio that were not funded. And that in just 2017, there's almost 2 million of unfunded projects. And on the bottom, it's going to list pedestrian and bicycle facilities, recreational facilities, and safe routes to school facilities, because all of those are biking and walking, but they're 3 different categories. So you can see there were 317 applications received and only 136 that were funded. So you'll have that. Let me see. So, and there's a lot of reasons. I have a comment from North Carolina that one of the problems is that they can't use state funds for the match. And I'll talk about the match in just a minute. Okay. So just to give you an idea of how transportation alternatives works, in fiscal year 2020, or we're in fiscal year 2019, so for this year and for next year, each year there's 850 million that goes to transportation alternatives. That money gets divided up among the 50 states based on population and road miles. The Rec Trails program comes off the top. The rest of that funding gets divided into two pots. 50% goes out by population, so that 50% is divided up by large metropolitan areas, those big MPOs of 200,000 population or more. They get their own pot of money and they can run a competition for projects within that metropolitan area. Small communities of less than 5,000, they get their own pot. So a certain amount of money is definitely going to be spent in those small communities. And then those in-between communities, 5 to 200,000, they also get a pot. And that was done to protect mostly the small communities, to make sure that they would get a piece of it. The other 50% goes through a competitive process at the state and can go to anyone. Now, like I said, those large MPOs, they run their own competition, but even the two other population pieces, the state runs that. So, a couple of things we'd like to see. We'd like to see increased funding. So under the FAST Act, transportation alternatives right now, it's limited to that dollar amount, to that 850. And that's a problem because all the other programs grow through the years because they're a percentage, but we've been stuck at the 850. The other problem is sometimes Congress will add more money in, as they did these last 2 years, but because we were stuck at a dollar amount instead of a percentage, we didn't increase. So our fix for that is to increase transportation alternative funding and make it 10% of the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program. And that way it will grow the same rate as other funding. So instead of being 850 million that came out of the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, we want to make it 10%. Okay, so this is what that would look like. So instead of the 850 at the top, you see the 10%. Okay. So the next change we want to make, you know, when we made this program, we talked a lot about local control. We still believe in local control, but there's a couple places we'd like to give state a little more flexibility. The first is that there are several states, particularly Western states, that would prefer to suballocate all of their transportation alternatives to local governments, whether that be to the planning organizations like MPOs and rural planning organizations, or to counties. But under the FAST Act, all the projects must go through a competitive process. We really think that because the local control was the overwhelming theme, that suballocating it all is within the spirit of the law, even if it's not within the letter of the law. So we'd like to fix that by allowing states to suballocate 100% of their transportation alternatives if they choose. They'd have to get that plan okayed by the Federal Highway Administration, and they'd have to track how that money is spent, what projects get built, so we know that it's still going to local priorities like biking and walking, but we would allow that. The other thing we hear from the state is that some of these small and mid-sized cities, they're giving us applications, but they're not actionable applications. They're not well done. And it's true that some of those small and mid-sized cities don't always have the capacity to put together strong applications and to navigate the implementation process. So our fix is to give the state access to 5% of TA funds. So they can do two things. One, that they can actually staff the TA program at the state level to get those applications moving. And the other is that they can use it to offer technical and engineering assistance to local governments. And that will help produce stronger applications and also help implement the program and implement those applications. Particularly for Safe Routes to School projects, that would also help to push those projects through the system. So what that looks like in our chart, that 5% for technical assistance, and then the option to sub-allocate all the rest. Two small changes we'd like to make on local control. Actually, this first one is kind of a big one. Right now, those large metropolitan planning organizations, they get to run their own competition. That's true. They run the competition, they select the projects, but they don't have the ability to obligate the funds. And what that means, obligating the funds is sort of locking them in, and that's what's required to start the implementation of the project. Right now, that final piece is still up to the state, but we want to let large MPOs have the authority to obligate projects so that they can implement it. They have the ability under other funding, and we want to give them the ability under this one. So, okay. Oops. The other thing for small MPOs, for those metropolitan areas that have a population under 200,000, they're both not represented in the population side, and they're not allowed to apply for the state competitive process. And that seems unfair. They're kind of locked out. So we want to make sure they are eligible to submit transportation alternative projects as well. You know, when you think about it, if you're in one of those smaller areas, trying to build a trail that goes across municipalities, that planning organization is probably the right place to manage it. So we want to make them eligible. And so those are the last two changes here, where metropolitan areas with a population over 200,000 can obligate, and small MPOs can apply to the state competitive process. All right. So, yeah, I also got a question about the rural planning organizations and their ability to find the match locally. Something else that's in that we're talking about, but is not on your fact sheet, is that right now, every project, you have to have the 80% federal match, 20% local match. One thing we're suggesting is that the whole program should have to be 80-20, but for some of the smaller communities, low-income communities, maybe the state could offer more and meet them at 90 or 95%, and that maybe some of the bigger cities could take on more of the cost themselves, so maybe do, I don't know, 60-40 or something like that. Another thing we'd like to do with safety funding is say, if TAP is funding a safety project, then maybe they should be able to use the safety funding for that other 20%. Those are some of the details that we're talking about. We didn't put it in the summit ask because it gets really complicated, but if that's something you're interested in and want to talk about in your offices, find me and I'll get you some information on that. Find me at the summit. Okay, so the ask to this one is very similar to the ask for the safety. We know EPW committee is asking the Senate offices for their transportation priorities this month. Will you please support increased funding for and improvements to the Transportation Alternatives Program and convey that to the Environment and Public Works Committee? All right, so those are, okay. So that's the ask. Just quickly, in terms of a review, in the House, we're going to do the co-sponsor bills, the Bicycle Commuter Benefit Act and the Commute Act. We're also going to bring up the Vulnerable User Safety Special Rule because we have a Democrat ready on that bill. We're just looking for a Republican, so we'd like to introduce that soon, and we'd like to get that idea out there. Maybe we'll find the co-sponsor at the summit and through the summit meetings. And then in the House, we also have the Congressional Bike Caucus, so we want to ask members to join or to rejoin. In the Senate, we will also have the COMMUTE Act. Will you co-sponsor the COMMUTE Act? And then the other is, will you list bicycle and pedestrian safety and improvements to transportation alternatives as transportation priorities to the EPW committee? Because those, usually we would wait until we have a bill, but because we know that all the senators have to get their priorities in the next couple of weeks, we want to put these on there. And we're also looking to get bills introduced in the Senate. So just getting them on the radar of the transportation staffers and in those offices will make it easier for us once we get the bill to get co-sponsors. All right. And so I'm going to pause now and get some questions. I'm going to put that up. I did see. So, all right. Yeah, questions on the ask. So I got a question about tips for students at the Bike Summit. I think in terms of lobbying, the biggest tip I have is to prepare. I'll send you the blog, which will have the link to all these asks there, to look them over, see if you have any questions, come Sunday morning prepared with those questions. But then also think about what is the best argument that would convince my member of Congress. Is it that these are going to improve quality of life? Is it that this is going to help attract businesses and help businesses attract the kind of employees they want? Things like that. Also in your packet will be the bicycle friendly awards, whether that be businesses, communities, universities in your state, but also your state progress report from last year. So those are some things to think about. I got a question. So does the Bicycle Commuter Benefits Act specify the number of times a week or a month that someone needs to bike to be eligible? Nope, it's going to be up to the employee on how much money they want to put pre-tax towards a bike benefit. So yeah, so you can say, I want to put the whole amount, $52 a month, and I'm going to collect it all to buy a new bike. Or you could do your bike share membership, maybe $10 a month, maybe that's all you want to put on it. But it's up to the employee to do that. Now, the bike benefit in the past came out of the employer's pocket. This benefit is employees pre-tax, but employers always have the option to do post-tax too if they so choose. Okay. All right. Any other questions about the asks? Or any questions about the Bike Summit in general? Okay. One thing I'll also say, there's a lot of new members in Congress. A lot of these new members may not have well thought out transportation policy ideas in general, transportation ideas. They're still probably learning how transportation funding works. So in offices like that, you want to make sure that if they haven't thought that much about transportation, they certainly haven't thought that much about bicycling and transportation policy. So for there, you really want to stress any local benefits. If you have an article that's from your community, if you have a statement by a mayor or elected official or chamber of commerce, something like that would be really helpful. But also spend not a ton of time, because your meetings are really 15 to 30 minutes. And especially if you have a group of people, you want to go quick through the introduction so you can get to the ask. But you do want to spend a little bit of time maybe asking that staffer, hey, what's your experience with biking? Have you ever, have you biked recently? Do you ever use bike share? Anything like that. One thing we'll have codes to send them for free bike share passes if that's interesting, if that's something that they're interested in. So we got a question here. Does the commuter benefit presentation include a conversation on the inequality of the parking benefit? We don't. That's a good point, but the parking benefit, it's really popular, and so it's hard to attack it. We don't want to always be seen as against it. We are working on a larger commuter bill that would benefit transit and biking and other modes more. Got a question, can you obtain a packet if you're not attending the summit? Well, I'll send out to everyone on this list a blog tomorrow that will have links to drafts. It won't have the bill numbers, but it will have everything else, so you can have that. If you would like the final pieces, I would say yes, but wait until after the summit to contact me for it, and I'll get it to you. Got a question about how does this fit into the Green New Deal? So the Green New Deal is a resolution. It's not a bill. So it's just basically a sense of Congress that we care about these things. I was actually very disappointed with the transportation section of the Green New Deal because it didn't talk about mode shift and it didn't talk about reducing the need for cars. It just talked about electrifying the fleet. The League put out a bike New Deal, which is on Twitter and on our blog if you want to check that out. But if the Green New Deal comes up, I would talk about, hey, one of the easy fixes that Green New Deal misses is that we could promote this mode shift in travel, that we could build communities where it's easy to get around without needing cars and combustible engines. California just did a study where they showed that even if they meet their electrification goals, they're not going to meet their greenhouse gas emission reduction goals because there's going to be so more, because VMT, vehicle miles traveled, is increasing so fast that they'll still be polluting more. Got a question of someone that you haven't heard back from a couple of the schedulers for representatives. So if you are a state coordinator and you are scheduling your meetings, then it's probably time to go directly to the transportation staffer. If you don't know who that is, email me and I will send you the name of and the email of the transportation staffer, and we'll set that on. And I'll send that on. But if you are not a state coordinator, your meetings are being set for you. So please don't set up meetings if you're not a state coordinator. That's just going to confuse the Hill offices. All right. Yeah. So also on the Green New Deal, you know, if that comes up and they're supportive of it, then you can say, hey, we like the ideas behind the Green New Deal, but they missed this important piece of transportation, and talk about it that way. One thing we'll talk about in the How to Lobby session is even if you are really liberal and you're going into a really liberal member of Congress, or you're really conservative and you're going into a really conservative members of Congress, you don't want to get political in those meetings because the staff on the Hill, in general, they have good staff relationships across the board. And if you're insulting another member of Congress or you're insulting people that follow them, you may be insulting your staffer's friend. And so we really say keep to the issue, keep to how it benefits your district, and leave the political stuff for TV. All right, I think we're done. Thanks so much, everyone. My email is caron@bikeleague.org. If you have any more questions, go ahead and contact me. By the end of the day tomorrow, I will send you an email with a recording of this presentation, the slides as a PDF file, and a link to a blog that will have all the asks for the summit. If you need anything else summit-wise ahead of time, go ahead and contact me in the next few days. If you want materials or more follow-up, like that question on the MPOs, great question, please contact me post-summit when I'll have a little more time to focus on it. So thanks, everyone. Look forward to seeing you, and have a good night. Thanks.